Hello, everybody, from a disembodied voice across the Atlantic Ocean. This is Dr. Kurt Braddock, and I am said disembodied voice. I apologize for not being able to be there in person, but I actually had a bit of a family emergency that struck while I was waiting in line at the airport to get on my Aer Lingus flight to fly over to the Netherlands. But Derek was cool enough to allow me to do my presentation remotely in this fashion and to play it in my place at the panel. So I hope that you enjoy the presentation despite not having me there to read your boredom or excitement, depending on how you feel about it. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a study that I completed that'll be going up for publication in the next couple of weeks. This study is on a method of preventing persuasion within communication studies called communicative inoculation. And I'll talk a bit about what communicative inoculation is over the course of this presentation. But the basis of this study was to extrapolate a long-established strategy for preventing persuasion into the realm of violent extremism. So over the course of this presentation, I'll talk about inoculation theory a little bit and talk about how it extends into my rationale for having conducted this study. I'll talk about the method that I used and my results, and I'll talk about a few of the implications of the findings that I discovered, of which I thought there were many. So first, let me talk about what inoculation theory is. Now, at the base of inoculation theory is a biological metaphor related to our immune systems. And for those of you that are unaware, the way that our immune systems work, or the way that we defend against viruses, when we are exposed to a virus in the natural world, or if we're exposed to a virus via a vaccination or an inoculation, that virus, it multiplies inside our bodies, at which point our body develops antibodies to protect against that virus or that bacteria. And those antibodies should stay in our body to the point at which, if that same bacteria or virus comes to try to attack us again, the antibodies repel it and it can't take hold within our bodies. Inoculation theory says that the same can be done with communication. So rather than try to persuade people actively, inoculation theory says that people can be protected against persuasion. And there's multiple elements in constructing an effective inoculation message. They take many forms, but all forms of inoculation message have these two elements. Number one, explicit forewarning. You tell somebody that somebody will try to persuade them and change their mind about whatever position they currently have, and that the people that will come to try to persuade them have been very successful in doing so in the past. The point of this is to make the person feel vulnerable that their established beliefs and attitudes are at risk for changing. Second, there's an element called refutational preemption, and this is where you offer the person some tools, usually communicative tools, to challenge the messages they may encounter. So first you tell the people that their beliefs and attitudes are at risk for changing, make them feel vulnerable, but then arm them with the tools they need to defend against messages they might encounter. Now, the interesting thing about inoculation in communication is that it's been shown to be effective in a large number of domains. Political communication, health communication, interpersonal communication. Across the board, it's one of the most reliable theories in communication. And this is done by arousing something called psychological reactance. Now, what psychological reactance is a negative form of arousal that you get when you recognize that somebody's trying to persuade you. We all have this intrinsic need to make our own decisions, to have volitional freedom, to be rulers of our own destiny. And when we recognize that autonomy is being threatened because somebody's trying to persuade us to do something, our natural tendency is to go in the opposite direction to reestablish our autonomy. So when you see the sleazy car salesman try to sell you a 1968 piece of crap Ford Pinto, and your first reaction is to be turned off to that and to go in the other direction, that is you experiencing psychological reactance. You might have a similar type of feeling when somebody asks to borrow $10. If somebody comes up to you in the street and tries to give you a pamphlet, all of these types of things, generally, people's first reaction is to say, no, I don't want that, because we feel it's a threat to our volitional freedom and we go in the other direction. Inoculation makes use of this by prompting preemptive psychological reactance in people. So, as one example that's popular in health communication, suppose somebody thinks that drinking malt liquor is bad for them. That's their established belief or attitude. That is a healthy belief for somebody to have. So Our goal would be to get the person to maintain that belief or attitude about malt liquor. We're not trying to change what they think, but we want to prevent others from being able to change what they think. So a health communication message might say that somebody might try to convince you that malt liquor is good, and it might even seem like it tastes good, but it tastes awful in the alcohol and it does damage to your liver. Try not to fall into that trap. Now, this is a very basic inoculation type message, but this type of message theoretically should guard against persuasion via other sources if that person tries to persuade our target here that drinking malt liquor is good. So again, what we're trying to do is protect against changes in beliefs and attitudes. We're not trying to change beliefs and attitudes themselves. So knowing all that, my rationale for this study is that my definition for radicalization or violent radicalization, depending on if violence is involved, is that it's a social and psychological process by which an individual develops beliefs and attitudes that are consistent with a terrorist ideology. Generally speaking, belief and attitude change occurs via persuasive messaging. So for me, radicalization is a persuasive process. And if radicalization is a persuasive process, why wouldn't inoculation work for preventing persuasion via terrorist propaganda if it works in other domains? So my rationale for this study was to take inoculation and bring it into the realm of violent extremism. Now, to do so, I have several hypotheses and a couple of research questions. Number one, I predict that people who are inoculated will feel greater psychological reactance in response to terrorist propaganda than those who aren't inoculated. They'll counter-argue more, and they'll feel greater anger in response to the terrorist message when they encounter it. My second hypothesis predicts that if a person receives an inoculation message relative to somebody who doesn't, they'll believe the group that developed the message, the terrorist propaganda, to be less credible. And finally, I predicted that if somebody's inoculated against terrorist messaging, they'll have less intention to support the group that developed the message. Now, some questions that I had, I couldn't make predictions for them. Number one, is the relationship between inoculation and persuasion moderated by message source or the ideology that the propaganda is based on? So suppose somebody is a former extremist and they present an inoculation message versus me as a researcher. Does that affect the relationship? And second, do left-wing ideologies, are they more susceptible to inoculation messages than right-wing? We don't know. So I'm going to test that here. And second, do reactance and credibility mediate the relationship between inoculation and persuasion? And we'll do that with a little structural equation modeling. So on the left here is the basic method that I used. I had 5 conditions, 2 left-wing conditions, 2 right-wing inoculation conditions. On both sides, there were 2 conditions in which one, the inoculation message was delivered by a former extremist, and the other was delivered by myself as a researcher. These were all written inoculation messages, but they were framed as coming from me or a former extremist. And I had a no inoculation control condition. Now, the dotted lines in the schematic here, they indicate that only white participants were allowed to go into those cells because the right-wing propaganda was related to white nationalism. The left-wing propaganda was related to anarchism, essentially, or extreme left-wing ideologies. So this was done with 357 participants via national opt-in stimulus survey via Qualtrics. And as you can see, there's a 2x2 between subjects design with a no inoculation control baseline to control against. As I said, the 2x2 are message source and message ideology. So we essentially have 4 comparisons here and the control message. And in the inoculation conditions, participants were exposed to left or right wing inoculation messages before they encounter the propaganda. The no inoculation control, they were just directly directed to the propaganda itself. So, results for hypothesis 1 through hypothesis 3. Almost across the board, I found support for all hypotheses. Individuals who were inoculated counter-argued against the message to a greater degree than people who weren't inoculated. People who were inoculated, that is, given an inoculation message, felt greater anger in response to the terrorist propaganda than those who weren't inoculated. People who were inoculated thought the group was less credible, the terrorist group was less credible than individuals who are not inoculated. And people who were inoculated with an inoculation message, they reported less intention to support the terrorist group than those who are not inoculated. Now, I haven't talked about how I operationalize these these outcomes. Basically, these were all different 7-point semantic differentials, except for support intention, which was on a scale from 0 to 100. Group credibility was 0 to 100 as well. So as you can see on the right-hand side, the results for counter-arguing, credibility, and intention were all significant at the 0.01 level, which is huge, and even anger, which the feeling anger toward the terrorist group who produced the propaganda was marginally significant at 0.08. Now you'll notice that my full H1 was not here. H1 predicted that individuals who are inoculated before seeing terrorist propaganda would feel greater psychological reactance. Now, psychological reactance is defined as the combination of counter-arguing and anger. So we'll see what the relationship is when we look at the second research question, which asks what the structure of the variables is. So pretty good results here for H1 through H3. Research question 1 asked whether or not the source of the inoculation message, that is, myself as the researcher, or someone framed as a former extremist, did that change the degree to which these outcome variables came out? And my test showed that no, they didn't. Whether or not I presented the message or that the inoculation message that they received was framed as coming from me or as from a former extremist, these inoculation messages were pretty consistent across the board. And the same could be said for propaganda ideology. Regardless of whether the person was exposed to left-wing propaganda or right-wing propaganda, if they received an inoculation message before seeing that propaganda, they were more likely to have these negative outcomes. However, there was no difference across propaganda itself. So the left-winger, people who saw the left-wing propaganda did not counter-argue more than the right-wing propaganda and so on, not at a significant level anyway. So the answer to this research question is that inoculation messages seem to be consistently applicable regardless of who is delivering the inoculation message. And finally, kind of the bread and the potatoes, or the meat and the potatoes of this study is this here. Essentially, I used Amos 25.0 to test the variable structure using different covariance matrices to determine how the different variables predict each other. And this model fit the data closest. Now what we're looking at here, these are all standardized variables and all standardized coefficients, and every number you see is significant at least the 0.01 level. P is less than 0.01 for every number you see here. So what we see here is that when somebody is inoculated, they experience significantly greater psychological reactance and significantly less perceived credibility of the extremist group that developed the propaganda. In turn, people who feel greater psychological reactance feel less intention to support the extremist group. People who perceive the extremist group to be credible are more likely to support the extremist group. So what this shows is that although there is no direct relationship between inoculation and intention, there are significant indirect relationships through reactance and through perceived credibility of the group. Inoculation has significant effects on things that themselves predict intention to support the extremist group. And this means that inoculation is an effective way to counter-radicalize people, or ways to prevent against the assimilation of extremist ideologies. So let's look at all the results together. First, communicative inoculation increases reactance in response to extremist propaganda and diminishes perceptions of the extremist group's credibility, both of which I feel are very important outcomes. In turn, psychological reactance and perceptions of the group's credibility predict intention to support the extremist group, as we just saw. And something very important is that these relationships remain robust across both left and right-wing extremist ideologies, and whether the source of the inoculation message was either myself as the researcher or someone framed as a former extremist. I should also note that we also tested for political ideology, left-wing versus right-wing, and used them as controls, and these relationships were robust even when the controls were put into place. So these inoculation effects seem to be quite robust. So the implications of the study. First, within communication science, it extends an already extensive theory into another realm where it can be of use. It shows that although inoculation theory has shown to be effective in health, in politics, interpersonal communication, and all these other domains, it's also effective in the realm of violent extremism. As I said, there's no direct relationship between inoculation and behavioral intention, but there's persuasive practices that increase reactance or reduce credibility of the extremist group can reduce behavioral intention, and this study shows that inoculation can do both of these things. and it offers potential empirical support for the development of counter-radicalization practices. And this is where I get on my soapbox and proselytize that we need experimental social science to develop counter-radicalization practices, especially ones that are put into formal structures. So many times we argue that we aren't able to determine whether or not something is effective until after it's already implemented. We can do better. We can use theories that have been long established within different social sciences, test them in this manner, and then build from there to develop effective counter-radicalization practices. And this is just the beginning. From here, I'm going to extend this inoculation scholarship into different areas, look at different ideologies, test whether or not different political proclivities affect these relationships, and so on. The sky's the limit with these sorts of theories, and I think we should really take advantage of that. So with that, I will stop there. Please feel free to contact me any way you want. Unfortunately, I'm not there to see either scowls or smiles, so I don't know how you feel about what you just saw, but I would love to hear any questions you might have, or if you'd like a synopsis of the study that I did, which is going out for publication, or it's already out for publication. I believe it's under review somewhere. But if you'd like a one-page synopsis of the study, please let me know, and I would be happy to send you the one-page synopsis so you have what I've done so far. So I will leave it at that. Again, thank you to Derek for allowing me to do this, and I hope you're all enjoying VOX-Pol so far. I wish I could be there with you. Take care from the East Coast of the United States.